Welcome to the Book Show, a celebration of reading and writers. I'm Joe Donahue. Shifting through time and perspective in contemporary India, Deepti Kapoor's novel Age of Vice is an epic, action-packed story propelled by the seductive wealth, startling corruption, and bloodthirsty violence of the Wadia family. Loved by some, loathed by others, and yes, feared by all. Equal parts crime thriller and family saga, Age of Vice is a novel of gangsters and lovers, false friendships, forbidden romance, and the consequences of corruption. Deepti Kapoor grew up in northern India and worked for several years as a journalist in New Delhi. Her previous novel is Bad Character. It is a great pleasure to welcome Deepti Kapoor to this week's book show. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Give us a sense of what brought you to this family drama and of saying, okay, I want to take on this really great big story.
Yeah, I didn't actually intend to write this big sprawling family saga at the beginning. I thought I'd write a small novel about the Delhi rich, like a little kind of Delhi Gatsby-like novel about all the horrible things rich people do to other people, and then they retreat behind their wealth. But very soon I realized that if I'm writing about um, the extremely wealthy in India, I'm also actually writing a novel about inequality and corruption and politics and power. That changed as I was kind of thinking about it and fixing on my characters. This novel also became an inquiry into the processes and networks of corruption, of power, of complicity, but also trying to figure out how to weave that into a sort of thriller like propulsive story. That became the challenge.
What interested you in the early days of that idea of a Delhi Gatsby, that type of story?
So I spent a large part of my 20s in Delhi as a journalist, in the day anyway. And then at night, I had very wealthy friends. I'm not wealthy myself, I don't come from that kind of family background, but I did have these friends who were part of these newly emerging business families that, with the liberalization of the 90s, suddenly became super wealthy. And all the privilege and glamour associated with that wealth, which meant big decadent parties in these big private mansions with domestic servants similar to Ajay, making sure that all your needs were met. So I was sort of a witness to that world in my 20s. And then later on, I moved to Goa. I changed my life around. I taught yoga. I started to write novels. And it just felt that my journalism years and those years could come to some use in this other way. But I also then decided that, of course, it's not going to be this novel just about the rich. It's going to be much more than that.
You mentioned one of the lead characters who is Ajay, and this is a young boy at the beginning of the book, and we follow him really from rags to living in a mansion. A fascinating character and in a fascinating way in which he matures and grows. Talk a little bit about the inspiration in drawing this character.
So Ajay is the heart of the novel, and I don't think I would have written this particular novel if I hadn't met the inspiration for Ajay. I was traveling in the mountains in my 30s. I lived in a little guest house. I met a young boy who had a story of loss, who'd been sent away to work to pay off the family bills, and he was just so full of hope for the future. And I remember combining his story with the lives of the young men who used to work these private mansions and serve you, especially at these big extravagant parties late at night, make sure that you were okay, but always silent. invisible to so many people. Always, I wondered about them, and that's when so Ajay's character is kind of like um, both of these, the young boy who then turns into
Hmm.
this man, this very loyal servant. um, and yeah, and that's how actually, um, when I came up when I was able to fix on the character of Ajay, really is when, when I realized I had my novel.
Hmm. This is a young boy who is basically sold to people he eventually calls mom and dad.
Yeah, he's mummy and daddy, actually. Yeah,
Yep.
and it's this kind of strange relationship because they're kind of abusing him, but they're also being nice to him. It's interesting because he's not used to even this generosity of the fact that they are happy to have him eat how much ever he wants to, and they even ask him in the beginning, would you like to sit with us? But at the
Hmm.
same time, they don't pay him, he doesn't go to school, they don't school him. He is the farm boy. Yeah, so it's a very strange relationship, and it was just kind of like abuse but mixed with love. Yeah, it's just an interesting relationship.
I
Yeah.
think it's fascinating of how quickly he gets caught up in the story of Sonny, who is another star of this book, who's really the gangster, and the family dynamics there. But for Ajay, of just how quickly that he enters that world, it's quite a rise.
Yeah, Ajay meets Sunny and instantly almost falls for him. He falls for his confidence, his audacity, his wealth, and he just wants to be part of that world. Even if it's in a very asymmetrical position as the servant, but he still gets to be part in the room. And Sonny is the only son and heir to this big business criminal fortune. He dreams of moving away from his father. He dreams of building the city. um, he dreams of doing his own thing, but he's also not ruthless enough. He also wants to please his father. So that was a dynamic that was fascinating for me to explore. Just this father who creates the family fortune, but this son who's now got his ideas, but he isn't ruthless enough.
The way you unfold the story, I think, is fascinating because there is some time skipping around, but it gives you a great way of presenting the various stages of Ajay and his career path, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, it just something that I work a lot with what feels right. I don't outline as much, so it just felt like it was the right way to show Ajay's journey.
The name of the new novel is Age of Vice by Deepti Kapoor. It is published by Riverhead Books. We've been talking about Ajay. We talked a little bit about Sunny. I would like to get more into Sunny, but the novel centers around Ajay, who comes, as we mentioned, from extreme poverty, and then there is Sunny, who comes from extreme wealth, and then there is the journalist Neda, who is really there in the middle and has a strong relationship with both of these characters and both of these extremes.
So I would say that Neda, she's not in the middle as much as very close to Sunny's world, and her family background is interesting. She comes from old money and a culturally elite family. She lives in a very powerful address in New Delhi, an address that speaks of access to power. Her family, they are somewhat bohemian, but also quite cultured, and but their power is waning in this new India, where people like Sunny's wealth and is coming in and taking over. So someone like so Sunny, in fact, wants to impress Neda because he thinks that she's still someone who represents this elite, and that was really interesting for me to play with this class background. That and Neda is someone who thinks that she is a good person, that she's a the idea of like exploring the compromises, the moral compromises that people like Neda make in
Mm.
the city, in the country, was just some very interesting, because it's this complicity that I also, as a middle class person who benefited from the liberalization of the 90s, who benefited from the way the economy transitioned, um, and all the freedom and new ideas and opportunities it gave me, while not really thinking of the foundation of extreme inequality and suffering that it's built on. So that was what I wanted to do with Nether.
Netta is a journalist, which feeds into the story as well. And obviously, this character is very well educated, and as journalists tend to be, an extremely curious person.
Yeah, she's curious, she's a little bit naive, and she is caught between her desire for Sunny and the world, the seductive allure of that world, but also a little bit of morality, and what her colleague Dean is telling her about these people. They're dangerous, and you shouldn't get involved with them. So that was interesting. It's like, what's she going to choose? What kind of decisions is she going to make? And the decisions that she does eventually end up making change the course of her life and that of people around her, tragically.
You talk about Dean, and Dean is a character that works with Netta, and it's an interesting character because it really the moral compass of all of this, sort of saying, we here's where we need to be careful.
Yeah, Dean is someone that I was just very interested. I mean, I've known journalists like Dean, who are just so incredibly good at what they do, and they know what's right and what's wrong instantly, and they're just out to get at the truth. But often they just get beaten down by the system, and by the corruptions inherent in the system. So that was just, and people like Neda end up thriving. So, I mean, poor Dean.
What does it say about these characters? Because they're all trying to change their position, or they're all trying to evolve, and that's really hard to do.
Yeah, I think it says about the lack of agency, at least in Ajay's life, where he is actually really trying to change his world, his social standing. There's that scene when he tries to go to the mall, and he wants
Mm.
to be Sunny. He wants, he's so loyal. He's and but he can't. I mean, eventually he's so expendable, and so this was also interesting because India in the 90s went on this journey towards becoming a more capitalist economy. So there was more social mobility within that, but also for people like Ajay, that's he's never really going to be able to cast off to shake off his identity. And someone like Neda thinks she has no control over her life, but she does. But her tragedy is that she doesn't. And Sunny, most of
Mm.
all, I mean, he has the power to change the lives of people around him, but he again chooses to please his father, to tragic consequences.
There is a point. It seems to me that as you said, this is set in the '90s, and there was a point where you were living in Delhi, and I'm interested of how much of that old world existed, or are you harkening back to a time that simply doesn't exist anymore?
I think the time period that I'm, writing about, a lot has changed. It's almost like everything started happening at that point of time.
Hmm.
Um, we had the first McDonald's and the first, TGIF, the first bowling alleys, the first malls. I was kind of writing about it for these newspapers, and now it's like Delhi is this thriving global crazy city. Liberalization has just supercharged it. Gurgaon is the city just on the outskirts of Delhi. It used to be farmland, and now it's just this massive city full of like all the big multinational companies, office buildings, hotels everywhere. It feels unrecognizable from what it was, but it was interesting because it was all starting at that point of time.
Well, one of the things, and you touched on this earlier, but one of the things that you really capture in the book is the way that the city consumes someone like yourself and all of these characters, obviously.
Yeah, I have this great intense relationship with Delhi. I came of age there. Some significant life changing events happened to me. So I spent years just driving the city, and I think collecting people's stories, listening to them. That's what I wanted to get across: the physical landscape, the soundscape, the kind of compromises people make when you live in Delhi, the corruption, the morality. It's like a deeply religious city, but that's also very immoral. The intoxication of the streets, the way you live this kind of really difficult, unpleasant life in Delhi, so that when someone offers you some little luxury or comfort at the end of the day, you take it. And then later on, you think about the consequences. I wanted to get all of that across.
Mm. When you were working there, did you feel as though you were stuck, that it was hard to get out?
Sorry, to get out of the city?
Yes.
Yeah, actually, I sometimes felt I would never be able to leave. And it's also like a city where, at least in those years, I felt every moment. I was living it very intensely, experiencing all those sensations, pain, pleasure, everything. But after a point of time, it came, I couldn't be there anymore. I had to leave. And then I had to write about it and spend the rest of my life. It's like this itch, I'm constantly scratching this Delhi itch.
What was that like when you realized that you were that you were collecting these stories for a real reason, that there was that you could put these stories and put these experiences to very good use?
Honestly, at that point of time, I didn't think I would, consciously anyway. I think subconsciously, I always knew it was going to go somewhere, because I just had so much material, and I didn't think I would become a novelist either. So that turned out to be the best form, because you can fictionalize things and you can exaggerate and create narratives around characters. So, but I guess I always had, like a part of me that was mentally, furiously making notes somewhere in some part of my brain.
Deepti Kapoor is our guest on this week's book show. The name of the new novel is Age of Vice. It is published by Riverhead Books. I want to go back to Sunny for a moment. You write, Sunny says, no one gets their life back. No one ever gets it back. Life just runs away from you. It never comes back, however hard you try, however much you want it to. This is the lesson you should know. You have to adapt or die. That almost seems like it's the mission statement of the novel in a way.
Yeah, I mean, it's also, sort of commentary on India and how difficult it is, and how you've just got to keep finding a way to live there, especially if you don't have the same opportunities or education or privilege and money that most Indians don't have that, so they've got to find ways to just get by and adapt. And it's interesting that I put that into Sunny's mouth because
Right.
he comes from a lot of privilege, but he also comes from this idea that he comes from dirty money.
And in writing that, did that come early or later in the writing of the novel?
It came earlier on.
And as you said, you're not an outliner. So did it help? Not saying that line in particular, but at this point, were you starting to get an idea of where all this was headed, of what this was going to accomplish?
Yeah, I think I also work a lot, very visually. I work in scenes and images, and then I kind of translate them into prose. And I kind of knew where it would be headed, but lots of surprises were thrown at me by myself along the way. So I worked with that too. So sort of like the subconscious was planting ideas, and then I had intruding into sort of the reality of actually writing them, and I was working with that too. I was kind of like accommodating everything, and
I,
it's probably not uh, the greatest way to work, but it's what works for me.
so one of the things that has been said or has come out since the book has come out, which is that it is the first in a trilogy. At what point did that come into your mind? Was that always the intention, or did that evolve?
Oh no, no, that was never the intention. I just wasn't done with the characters. I had a third of the novel left, I think, and I still had so much to write, and it was either I could do a 1,500 word page novel, which no one would read, and rightfully so, or I could break it down into three books, and that's what my agent suggested I do. At that point of time, I didn't think it would be the next many years of my life,
Hmm.
and here I am. So yeah.
Obviously, I mean, personally, I want to know a lot more about Ajay. I assume that's part of the story of Ajay building himself back up.
You basically have just gotten inside my head. Yeah, that's it. Ajay building himself up. How do you develop a consciousness from a place where your identity has been connected to someone else? So that's interesting. So Ajay's story is going to be, sort of one of the big stories of the book. Also, Vicky and Bunty's backstory. How did they become these powerful, fearsome businessman gangsters that we meet? What happens to Sunny now that he has what he wanted? And Nether comes back to India. What does she do? So these are the stories.
One of the things that I think is interesting in the novel, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but you just said of Ajay building a new consciousness. But these are characters. All these characters have a conscience. They have a deep conscience. It's questions. It's challenge, but it certainly is there.
Oh no, I meant like consciousness.
An
Sorry,
awareness.
awareness. Yes. How to develop a self, sort of from the idea of the self that you had earlier, where you abused and manipulated by the people you trusted the most.
These are flawed people, but they're not bad people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the thing. They're often in situations not of their own making and that they can't control. And I wanted, I'm more interested in these kind of gray areas, not in really bad people or really good people. Because that's our lives, like all of us, right? We're all flawed to a certain degree.
How long did it take you to write this novel, and what do you have even a timeline for the other two books?
It took me about 3 years to write the novel, and I know what I'm going to do with the second one. I have notes and all of that already planned out. So hopefully a year to get a first draft out, and
Hmm.
then we'll see.
And
I mean,
then
yeah. I mean, you ask writers and novelists this question, and they'll always give you the most optimistic answer.
well,
Yeah,
that's good. That's good
yeah, yeah.
to be
That will
optimistic.
make their editor happy. And then let's see. But that I really do want to.
I'm curious as to how you've taken the reaction, the very positive reaction from the novel.
Super appreciative of the response, but it's also slightly strange to have this world and these characters that you've lived with for so many years, and then of course there's some editors and other readers, to suddenly get out in the world and you have people talking about them. It's very strange. So many readers all across the world getting translated into these different languages. It feels like a little bit surreal, and yeah, sometimes I'm very happy, and sometimes I'm a little bit scared.
Well, do you try to shut that off sometimes of to keep yourself away from of what is being said? Sometimes you just don't want to go to your own funeral.
Oh yeah, absolutely. If you want to protect yourself, as and also keep writing
Right.
novels, So many writers tell me do not read your own reviews, even if they're wonderful, and definitely stay away from Goodreads. And I think it's really good advice, because also you don't want to start second guessing yourself, especially when you're writing. You need to always think about writing for yourself first before anyone else.
And I don't know about you. It would seem to me, although you just seem to allude to it, that it is easy to second guess yourself especially when when you're passionate about it, and the characters better than those people do, and yet they say something that sort of it cuts in a way you're like, and then it's difficult to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why, I mean, my writing process when I actually start writing is just to cut off the world, and just try and be online as less as possible, and just work in the early hours of the morning with my cats who don't say anything and don't tell you what to do, and whether but they're there. There's a presence breathing softly. It's really important. And also to just protect yourself. I go on long hikes, I do yoga, I then have a break when I drink lots of wine.
Do you? I know you live in Portugal. Do you feel the need to go back to Delhi to sort of re-examine the place that you've been writing about?
Oh, absolutely. Delhi and also UP, Uttar Pradesh, where a large part of the novel is set or will be set, the next two. Yeah, I'm constantly going back there. I'm talking to my sources. I am doing loads of research and reading academic papers as well while I'm here. But it's really important. My process is very much get into the field like a journalist, and ask those questions, see how this all fits into my fictional world. But it is this kind of like real world, fictional world combination that I work with.
Deepti Kapoor's new novel is Age of Vice. It is published by Riverhead. We enjoy hearing from our listeners about our shows. You can email us at book@wamc.org. You can listen again to this or find past book shows via podcast or at wamc.org. Sarah LeDuc produces our program. Bookmark us for next.